So in this podcast, we're going to be talking about emotion. And so to kick off with, we need to consider why emotion is a good thing to experience. For the most part, emotion allows us to learn from experience and to behave in a very efficient way to new kinds of situations. For example, if we recognize that something may induce the emotion of fear in us, then that might promote us to escape from the situation quickly. Similarly, if something makes us feel angry, that may prompt us to attack. So we have different kinds of emotions, and depending on the emotion that we feel, that's going to elicit different types of behaviors in response to different types of situations. Generally, when we react emotionally, that is, in response to feeling emotion, then we often make a decision very quickly. Now, sometimes we regret those decisions, but in some cases, those very rapid decision-making processes are somewhat helpful. Taking it to a higher level, emotion allows us to make moral decisions. And hopefully, if we're experiencing emotions the way that people typically experience emotions, then we can make good moral decisions. So, when we're talking about studying emotion, we have to first think about what is emotion. So emotion is what we feel. We can say, I feel very angry, I feel very sad, I feel a little bit sad. And so it's subjective. It varies from person to person. And so it's really difficult to define it, and it's really difficult to measure it. Also, when we're thinking about the biological processes that underlie emotion, that's also confounded by the fact that emotion is complex. And complex psychological processes don't just involve one brain area. Purposefully, we started looking at the connection between brain and behavior by looking at which parts of the brain are involved with sensory processing. And with sensory processing, it's a little bit more defined. We can say that there are particular areas of the brain that are visual areas. But when it comes to more complex psychological processes like emotion, we'll see that much of the brain is active when we experience emotions. So what I'm trying to say is that these complex psychological processes are quite difficult to research. And even when we ask people to look at a face that is perhaps expressing a particular emotion, people interpret those emotions in different ways. People experience the same emotions in different ways. And we can sort of assume that when we do research that there's some similarities in the way that people experience emotions, but it's somewhat difficult to really know that. So from a psychological perspective, we think about an emotional state as having three distinct aspects. First of all, there's the cognitive aspect, and this doesn't have anything to do with the feeling that you have about a situation. So you might, perhaps it's dark and you're in a quiet part of the city by yourself, and it's late at night, and you are appraising the situation. You're thinking to yourself, is this dangerous? The next step is when your autonomic nervous system turns on. So in the first step, you're not feeling any activation of your nervous system. We're saying that the autonomic nervous system hasn't yet activated. So that first stage can be very, very rapid. You can appraise a situation really even without being consciously aware of it. But the second stage is when you've appraised a situation and decided that it's potentially dangerous. Then your body gets ready for action and your autonomic nervous system switches on. So just to remind you, the autonomic nervous system, remember that word auto, it's like automatic. This is the part of the nervous system that we don't have conscious control over. And it's divided into two main subdivisions: the parasympathetic nervous system and the sympathetic nervous system. So often when we're talking about readiness for action, we're talking about switching on the sympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system. So that's the one that gets us ready for fight or flight. The third stage of an emotional state and then the third stage of this emotional reaction is the actual feeling part. That's what we generally refer to as an emotional experience. And you can label it as, you know, I feel sad, or I feel scared, or I feel happy. So that kind of leads to this question that which comes first? Is it that your heart's pounding because you're afraid? Or do you feel afraid because you are aware of your heart pounding? So in physiological psychology, there is the question of which comes first, the autonomic arousal or the actual feeling. And it may seem counterintuitive that the autonomic arousal could come first and then the feeling comes later. But that's actually what the James Lange theory of emotion suggests. So both William James and Carl Lange came up with a very similar theory. So it's generally referred to as the James Lange theory of emotion. And this is the idea that the autonomic nervous system activation, or your action in response to a cognitive appraisal, is what your brain then interprets and leads to the feeling of an emotion. So for example here, you can imagine perhaps that you are looking at a spider, right? So you see a spider scurrying across your floor in the bathroom. You have to make a very rapid appraisal, and you might say, ooh, spider could bite me. And that makes your heart rate go up, and perhaps you run away, right? So this is the cognitive appraisal. This part is the autonomic nervous system arousal. And then according to this theory, you then say, ooh, I feel scared. Okay, so the feeling of fear does not come until you experience the autonomic nervous system activation. Now this very rapid appraisal can occur, as I said before, without conscious awareness. So in some studies, people looked at different pictures on a slide projector, and they were having their heart rate measured, and then they were asked to say how they felt. And so if you present a picture like this very, very rapidly, so you could actually have it up for about 120 milliseconds. So you may not actually be consciously aware of that picture. You may not say, I saw a spider, but there's something about the visual activation that increases your heart rate. So you can have this cognition very rapid without actually feeling anything. It's only after the activation of your autonomic nervous system occurs that you feel fear. So the James Lange theory certainly has quite a lot of support for it. And we think that perhaps the degree to which we experience emotions is related to the degree to which our autonomic nervous system is activated. So when we feel excited, it's because our autonomic nervous system is highly activated. When we feel intense emotions, it's because our autonomic nervous system is highly activated. So our heart rate is going very fast. We're feeling very sweaty. Our pupils are very large. So we're going to in the next slide, look at the evidence that helps to see whether or not the James Lange theory is supported or not. It suggests that if we don't have much input here, if we don't have much activation rather here in terms of either the autonomic nervous system or the action, like running away, then we shouldn't experience very intense emotions. So is this true or not? Okay, so this James Lange theory says that we have some kind of physiological arousal, or we have some kind of motor reaction like running away. And it's only by having that we're able to identify the feeling of the emotion. So it doesn't work very well for mild emotions. So the James Lange theory, if you're feeling a little bit scared or a little bit happy, doesn't really work very well for this, because we don't have very much activation of our autonomic nervous system or our motor system if we're only experiencing mild emotions. And therefore, it's hard to know why we're experiencing those emotions. People who have a paralysis of their muscles, right, who are not able to move their muscles, but they have normal autonomic nervous system function, they actually don't experience a decrease in emotion. So remember, the James Lange theory says, well, you might feel scared because you're running away. That might be part of it. Or it could be because your heart is beating fast. So this would suggest that if you're paralyzed, obviously you can't run away, but your autonomic nervous system would allow you still to have an increased heart rate if you saw something that you thought was scary, like a spider. Also, people who have a condition known as pure autonomic failure, so this is where their autonomic nervous system does not work, they do still experience some emotions, but they don't experience them as intensely. So again, these top three things don't really necessarily provide very strong support for the James Lange theory. So that suggests that there maybe is something else involved here, maybe something, a later cognitive process also involved in experiencing emotions. However, we do actually have quite a lot of support that the way our brains interpret what's happening in our body contributes to the feeling of the emotion. So for instance, panic disorders. A panic disorder is literally that. It's something that onsets, a panic attack onsets without any real cause. You can't pin it on something. Oh, I was feeling anxious because of this. It just happens by itself. Your heart starts to beat very, very quickly. You have a lot of sympathetic nervous system arousal, and people often feel very scared when that happens. And so that kind of really does support the James Lange theory. There's nothing in the environment that's turning on the sympathetic nervous system. There's no stimulus, if you like. It's just turning itself on by its automatically. But the way that you're interpreting this is that you feel very fearful, even though there really isn't anything to be scared of in the environment. The sensation of smiling actually helps you to feel happier. So there was a study done, I think this is described in your textbook, where people were asked to put a pen in their mouth while they were looking at some cartoons. So you either put your pen in your mouth sideways like this, which actually activates the muscles that you would use if you were smiling, or you put the pen in your mouth just so you hold it by the tip, and that doesn't induce the same muscles. And what they found was that people who had their pen sideways like this, they were activating the smile muscles, actually found the cartoons funnier than people that held the pen in their mouth in a different way that didn't activate the smile muscles. People who have Botox to get rid of their wrinkles, it's then very difficult for them to move their facial muscles, which is why sometimes people look a little strange after Botox. Or if alternately they may have had some kind of paralysis that affects their facial muscles, then they usually say that they don't experience emotions as intensely after having either the procedure or after the paralysis. In general, if we can reduce our autonomic activity, then we can reduce the emotion that we feel. So, people do this in different ways. They may meditate. They may do slow breathing to calm themselves down. And as they calm their autonomic nervous system activation, so they feel less intense emotions. So how is it that we are able to label the emotion that we experience? If we look at our physiological response, we see that lots of different kinds of emotions actually evoke very similar changes in our body. So when we feel excited and happy, it's kind of similar in terms of our physiological response to when we're feeling angry with somebody. So how do we know whether we're feeling angry or we're feeling happy and excited? So we need the cognitive appraisal that tells us, oh, this is a situation that's likely to make you feel scared, or this is a situation that's likely to make you feel angry, or this is a situation that's likely to make you feel angry. Right? So then we're able to not only label how intense the emotion is, but also what the actual emotion is. Am I feeling excited? Am I feeling angry? And that's a more modern interpretation of the James Lange theory, that we need to integrate the information from the cognitive appraisal to actually label the emotion that we're feeling. So hopefully you remember by now that when we experience emotions, we get activation of the limbic system. And the limbic system is a whole network of structures deep inside the brain. So we could refer to them as subcortical structures because they're below the surface, the cortex of the brain. So where you can imagine this picture here is looking inside the brain at this whole range of structures. So everything here that's labeled the cingulate, right? We've talked about the anterior cingulate, but here's a whole large part of the cingulate. We have the hippocampus here, this purplish structure. We have the amygdala. Those are the main structures that we think of as being involved in emotion, but any of these structures in the limbic system can be activated. The olfactory bulb has to do with smell, the sense of smell, and often smells can evoke quite strong emotions. There might be pleasant emotions, there might be unpleasant emotions, but smell is very closely linked to the activation of memories associated with emotions. In the same way that specific emotions don't elicit specific physiological responses in terms of our heart rate. So for instance, if we are experiencing extreme excitement because we're happy, our heart rate isn't really going to be very different from when we're experiencing extreme anger. Right? Similarly, our blood pressure is going to be elevated in both of those conditions. So specific emotions don't cause specific physiological reactions in our body, and nor do they really activate specific brain areas. So with the exception of the emotion of disgust. So disgust is pretty much the only emotion that activates the insular cortex. The insular cortex is the part of the brain that's also activated when we eat stuff. So that kind of makes sense. That this is the part of the brain that tells us whether something is yummy or not. So when something is really disgusting, our insular cortex is strongly activated, telling us, eek, this is not yummy. And even looking at, it doesn't have to be disgusting food that we're looking at that activates the insular cortex. It can be anything that induces that sensation or that emotion of disgust. So that could include looking at something really yucky. I'm not even going to describe anything there. I'll just let your imagination go there. It could even just be looking at somebody's face that looks disgusted. Will also activate the insular cortex. But that's really the only emotion that has a specific brain area that's associated with it. In general, emotions are going to activate the limbic system, and they're going to activate the frontal cortex and the temporal cortex. But if you look here, you've got a collection of results from many different studies. So each little dot on the cortex here, and also in deeper layers of the brain, represent what parts of the brain were active to a particular emotion. So for example, if we take the yellow, which is happiness, and then something opposite that's like fear or anger, which are both depicted here in kind of red colors, you can see that yellow and red areas are either overlapping sometimes or very, very close to each other. Okay, so it's not that we can say, I can look at somebody's brain activity and know that they feel happy, or I can look at somebody's brain activity and know that they feel angry. So it's really hard to actually tease that apart just from brain activity alone. And again, although there are not strong hemispheric differences for different types of emotion, we do see that the right hemisphere seems to be more responsive to emotional stimuli than the left. So for example, if you are in an fMRI study and they're playing clips of somebody crying or laughing, then you'll have more right amygdala activation, so more activation of the amygdala on the right side of the brain than on the left side of the brain. Also, the right hemisphere seems to be important for us to be able to process information about emotion when people are talking, and also to inflect emotion in our own speech. So people that have hemispheric damage to the right hemisphere, typically in the temporal lobe, they have difficulties recognizing people's emotion in their voices. So for example, I could say something like, oh, I had a really great day yesterday, versus, oh, I had a really great day yesterday. Right? So although I'm saying exactly the same words, I'm saying it with a very different prosodic tone. So the prosody in my voice, with the inflection in my voice, how it goes up and down, tells you whether or not I'm being sarcastic and I didn't actually have a good day yesterday, or I'm excited because I did have a good day yesterday. Right? So we can infer people's emotional states by their tone of voice, by their prosody. But if you have damage to your right hemisphere, then it's difficult for you to do that. Similarly, if you have right hemisphere damage to the speech areas, then often when you speak, your voice is very flat, so there's no emotion in your voice. A similar kind of thing there. So it's difficult for you to express the emotion, but also to understand it. In the textbook, it describes a WADA test. So a WADA test is usually used to see which hemisphere is dominant for language. So for most people, it's the left hemisphere for spoken language, but not for everybody. So sometimes before brain surgery, people have this WADA test where they can put to sleep one hemisphere or the other, at least for a short period of time, and ask people to talk. So if you inactivate the right hemisphere and people can still talk, then you know it's the left hemisphere that is really doing the job of language production. But if you inactivate the left hemisphere and people can still talk, then you would know that the right hemisphere is playing an important role. So in the study that is described in the textbook, what they did was they found that when both hemispheres were active, so not when any drug had been administered, people were able to describe emotional events that had happened to them in the past. And they could not only describe the event, but they could also describe the emotion that they were feeling. So they would actually experience the emotion in some form, at least, that they experienced when they actually had the event. So it could be something very happy in their life, and actually when they're describing it, they said that it made them feel happy again. However, when they inactivated the right hemisphere, even though they could describe the event still, they no longer actually felt the emotion. So again, this is all evidence to suggest that the right hemisphere is more important for experiencing and perhaps expressing emotion than the left hemisphere. So I said at the beginning that emotions are often used when we're making a decision. If our sympathetic nervous system is very strongly activated because we see something that's potentially dangerous, then that helps to protect us. So it activates our fight or flight response, and so typically if we see something that's very scary, then we withdraw from it, or we might run away. But emotions are also important in making moral decisions. And moral decisions are usually difficult decisions to make. And so they activate a lot of the brain areas. They activate the cingulate gyrus, which, if you remember, is part of the limbic system. They also activate the prefrontal cortex, and in particular an area in the ventral medial zone, which we refer to as the ventral medial prefrontal cortex. And also we see activation of the autonomic nervous system. So you might, when you're having to make a difficult moral decision, you feel it in your body. You feel your heart rate going up. You feel your stomach feeling a little bit wobbly. You might feel your muscles a little bit trembly. You might feel that your palms are a little bit sweaty. And one of the sort of classic case histories that help us to understand a little bit more about emotion is the story of Phineas Gage. So if you remember, Phineas Gage was the railroad worker who had an iron rod explode and go through his brain, the frontal part of his brain, and he actually had damage to his ventral medial prefrontal cortex. So he survived the accident. The pole was pulled out of his brain, and his personality changed. So he went from being a very conscientious, hardworking man to being somebody that lied a lot and gambled and got into fights, and actually lost his job pretty quickly because he wasn't turning up on time and was, a kind of difficult person to get on with. And so this tells us that the ventral medial prefrontal cortex is an important brain area for moral decision making. And since the days of Phineas Gage, there have been some neuroimaging studies that have also helped us to provide further evidence for that. So in neuroimaging studies where they want to study moral decision making, they have situations like this, which is called the trolley dilemma. So there's a moral dilemma here. You have to make some kind of decision, but it's not going to be easy to make. So in this particular scenario, you're shown this slide and you're given a choice, right? So the trolley right now is on track to come down here and basically run over this group of people and kill them. However, this is you. You can pull the switch and you can send the trolley down this track and you would only kill one person, right? So you can choose to do nothing and the trolley continues and kills 5 people. or you can choose to pull the lever and the trolley goes down a different path and kills only one person. Now, it depends on, neither decision is easy, right? You could do nothing, you kill 5 people. You do something and you still kill a person. So it's meant to feel uncomfortable. And you do see activation in those areas that we just mentioned. The sympathetic nervous system gets activated. You see activation in the cingulate gyrus, and you see activation in the ventral medial prefrontal cortex. And what studies have shown is that for patients that have damage to their ventral medial prefrontal cortex, then they don't switch. And I mean, I guess the majority of people do switch and decide to just kill one person, even though it's a difficult decision to make. But most people say, no big deal if I kill 5 people if they have damage to their ventral medial prefrontal cortex, because they really don't care about the consequences of their behavior. So quite a few studies of emotion have actually focused on aggression, for the reason that aggression is perhaps a little bit more easy to operationalize than other types of emotional behaviors. And so again, aggression is a complex emotion, and there are many factors that contribute to it. One such factor is the hormone testosterone. So there's been several studies showing a link between aggression and testosterone levels. So males have higher testosterone levels than females, and males also fight more and get arrested more than females do. Violent crime is highest in males who are between the ages of 15 and 25, and incidentally, these are also the members of the population who have the highest testosterone levels. Similarly, people who have been convicted of committing rape and murder have been shown to have higher levels of testosterone than those who were convicted for non-violent crimes. Now, you can, these are correlational studies, right? So we don't know for sure if testosterone is the cause of the aggression, but it's certainly higher in aggressive people than it is in those who are not aggressive. But it's not just testosterone, and the triple imbalance hypothesis has been suggested. So it's been suggested that people who have high testosterone levels in conjunction with low cortisol levels, so low cortisol is, cortisol is a hormone that's produced when we feel stress, and low serotonin levels, the triple imbalance says these are the people who are most likely to be aggressive, right? So those with high testosterone levels, low cortisol levels, and low serotonin levels. So if you have low cortisol levels, that suggests that even when you're in a highly stressful situation, you're not going to feel anxious. So low cortisol levels and low anxiety has been associated with psychopathy. Let's talk a little bit more about serotonin. Okay, so I've said that serotonin is a neurotransmitter that's implicated in aggression, and we know a little bit about serotonin from talking about it previously in the class. So we'll do a little bit of review first, but it's really important that you know that serotonin, low serotonin levels in of themselves are not going to cause aggression, right? So remember that the triple imbalance hypothesis, high levels of testosterone and low levels of serotonin and cortisol together are likely to increase aggressive behavior. Sorry. So what do we know about serotonin? We know it's a monoamine neurotransmitter. And remember, all neurotransmitters are made from precursors, ingredients, if you like, that we get from our food. So serotonin is made from tryptophan, and we get that from eating things like turkey. So in general, when we eat a lot of turkey, think Thanksgiving, we often feel very mellow afterwards. The tryptophan absorption from the turkey is aided by eating a lot of carbohydrates. So that's why we feel particularly mellow at Thanksgiving. Plus, we don't have to typically get up and go to work either. So serotonin works in lots of different parts of the brain, and so it has widespread implications for behavior. So it's not just aggression, other things as well. And you may remember that we've talked about low levels of serotonin being implicated in depression as well. In general, when serotonin levels are high, we feel happy, we feel confident, and we feel calm. So you can think of serotonin as kind of a feel-good neurotransmitter. And the way that we measure serotonin levels is usually by measuring the metabolites, the sort of the byproducts of serotonin usage, and we can measure that in blood or in urine or in the cerebrospinal fluid. So obviously it's less invasive to measure it in urine than it is in the other two. So it's not a direct measure of serotonin levels, but it's more how quickly is serotonin turning over or being metabolized in the central nervous system. And so low serotonin and turnover, which we're saying implies low serotonin levels, is what's been implicated in aggressive behavior. And that's been seen in both in animals and in humans. In humans, people with low serotonin turnover have been shown to be more likely to commit violent crimes. They're also more likely to be depressed, as we said before. They're more likely to commit suicide by violent means. So people who are depressed still have this kind of aggressive tendency, but it's aggression towards the self rather than toward other people. And also, low serotonin turnover has been implicated with aggressive behaviors among both children and adolescents. So with any kind of behavior, we're always interested in the genetic aspect to try and help us to understand why maybe some people or animals are more aggressive than others. And again, emotion, aggression, it's a complex behavior, so it's not a specific gene that's linked to aggression. It may be a combination of genes. But there are some studies to suggest that there is a genetic aspect to it. So there are some genetic profiles that may make you more likely to be aggressive. So one study showed that if you look at aggressive and criminal behavior in adults, that if you compare children who were raised in the same family as their biological parents, they were more like their biological parents than if a child had been raised in the family who had been adopted, right? And similarly, if we look at that child who'd been adopted and we look at their biological parents' aggression, then we would see that that child would look more like their biological parents. Monozygotic twins, so remember those are identical twins who come from one fertilized egg, so they have identical genes. They're more like each other in terms of their aggressive and criminal behavior than dizygotic twin pairs. But as with most complex behaviors, it's not just the genes, right? So environment plays a really important role too. So being exposed to lead, being exposed to smoke prenatally, cigarette smoke that is, being exposed to child abuse, all of these are risk factors for aggressive behavior too, and it's likely that these interact with genetic factors. One study that's shown that genes do interact with environment is a study by Caspi and colleagues, where they measured antisocial behavior and found that a particular gene that codes for what kind of enzyme you have to break down the monoamines, which include not only serotonin but also dopamine and norepinephrine. So you have this MAO enzyme, so monoamine oxidase, and the job of the MAO is to break down serotonin, dopamine, and norepinephrine. So I guess the results of this study are not what you would perhaps expect, apart from they do show an interaction with environment. So here you can see we've got two different genetic types, one shown in blue and the other shown in red. Okay, so this determines the kind of MAO enzyme you have. Do you have a very efficient one that breaks it down a lot? That would be the high group. Or do you have a less efficient one that breaks them down less, which would be the red group? And what you can see here is actually having low MAO activity, so less breakdown of those monoamines, is related to aggression, which isn't really what we would expect from the low serotonin hypothesis. But you see, the important piece here is that it interacts with childhood maltreatment. So it's only people who have been severely maltreated as children that have an increase in aggression if they have this low MAO enzyme gene.